After we have set up the shading and the lighting for our 3D scene, we now have to deal with rendering. And in this video we'll show you how to set up your render settings so that you save as much render time as possible. Everyone who has dealt with 3D animations before knows that the render part is very time consuming. And because of that, before you do the final rendering, you should do some test renders. That means a rendering with a lower resolution, and if you use cycles for rendering as we did for this scene, you also can render it with lower samples. And also you can disable some objects of your scene which are maybe not important for the render test, so it will also render even faster and you see if everything works right or not. And the advantage of this whole process is that we can avoid as much errors as possible for rendering our final scene. This can save us a lot of frustration and money, if you'll see in another video. Okay, let's have a look at our test renders we did while creating our 3D scene. Here you can see our first test render. You can see it has a very low resolution, and also you can see there are some errors on the particle systems for the meadow on the ground. And also the light setup is not correct for this scene, because it doesn't look like a glade deep in the forest. After you've done the first test render, you certainly go back to your scene and try to fix the errors, change the lighting, or whatever you want to change for your scene. Here on the second render you can see we have played around with the camera movement, and also we have adjusted the particle settings for the meadow down below so that it works right. This is the third test render we did. You can see we have used a higher resolution to see how the quality will look like, and also we tested some compositing effects. And now instead of the meadow we have the arrows on the trees. Very frustrating thing here. Yeah, by the way, the errors are caused because the particle systems are not baked. After you have adjusted the errors on certain objects, you certainly can render these objects without anything else, so it renders much faster and you can see if the errors are still there. Here you can see the first test we did with the mocap animated persons. As you can see, this is just a OpenGL viewport render. That means in some cases you don't need to do a real render, but instead you can do this OpenGL render I showed you in the video with the simulated tree leaves. And after that you can play the animation very smoothly to see how the animation, the movement and so on looks like and if everything works as expected. In this case you can see these are not the final animations of the persons. Here we have realized that it looks some kind of stupid if the both people are tugging on the robot. And because of that we have recorded the mocap animations again, so that it looks a little bit more decent. Here we did a second render with a 3D animated person, so that we can see how they are fitting in the rendered scene. For that we just choose a box with Ctrl B. So we just can render a small part of the image. This saves time and you can see if you fix something on one model or on one animation, how exactly this will look like without rendering the whole scene. Also you can see here we have water in our scene. This is also in our final scene, but with all the plans before it, you don't see it anymore. In our next render we tested everything together, the new mocap animations, all the particle systems, the compositing effects and so on. And we rendered this in a low resolution to see how everything fits together. So we really liked this render, so we just did another render with a higher resolution with the same settings. So when you're first looking at this looks great, but unfortunately we just have realized a little bit late that the branches of the ivy was disabled. And the reason for that was that the ivy was using a particle system for the leaves, and in the particle settings under render the emitter was disabled. So enable that, so the emitter, in this case the branches, will be rendered again. Yeah, and so we had to render this scene again. Yeah, in the end one frame has rendered about 40 to 50 minutes and we had to render 400 of these frames. On our personal computers this had taken forever, so we used a render farm. About how to use such render farms you will learn more in one of the next videos. Okay, now let's adjust our render settings so that our scene renders very fast, but with a very good result. There are some general render settings which radically decreases the render time, but not really change the quality of our final image. We navigate to our render tab of the properties editor. And we start with the dimension settings. Here under resolution we can set up the size of our image. And here is already set up the full HD resolution 1920 by 1080. And we will use this setting for our rendering. Down below this percentage value I increase to 100% so that 100% of this resolution will be rendered in the end. Under frame range you can set up the start and end frame of your animation. In this case we will render 400 frames. And here I use 25 FPS, that means 25 frames per second. And here in Germany this is the general settings for videos. In other countries this may vary a bit. That means 25 rendered frames are 1 second video in the end. That means we have to render 25 times 50 minutes to have a 1 second long animation. Our 400 frames will be 16 seconds of video in the end. Okay, now we take a look at the sampling settings. In this video I won't dive deep into how cycles the render engine works, because this is a workshop for advanced users and I don't want to increase the running time of this tutorial unnecessarily. More details about the cycles render engine you find in the internet. If I render our scene with Shift-Z directly in the viewport, I've disabled some objects here so it renders a little bit faster. You can see the rendering starts very rough, you can see the big pixels, and with every render step the quality of the image gets better and better. And in the render settings under samples we are able to set up how many of these render steps should be rendered. Under preview you can set up the samples for rendering directly in the viewport, and under render you can set up the samples which will be used for rendering the final image or the final animation. If you render a still frame with a high resolution you should increase the samples much, maybe something between 500 and 1000 samples. And if you render an animation you should decrease the samples something between 200 and 500 to get a very good quality. It all depends on your scene and what quality you want to have in the end. In our case here we use a very low samples value. We type in 50. Because even with such low samples our scene renders very long, because basically it's a very complex scene. But I show you a simple trick which allows you to only use 50 samples but also get a relatively noise-free render result. Okay, let's talk about the clamp options on the left here. In some cases when you render your scene it may appear some of these small white dots. They are called fireflies. These bright spots are caused by a very bright lamp shining onto a glossy surface. In this case we have a glossy ball and a very bright point lamp besides. And basically Cycles tries to create caustics. These are the bright spots on the ground reflecting from a glossy surface. But you can see that does not really look good. And these both clamp values are there to decrease the brightness of these white spots. In general you can use a value between 4 and 5, that looks good in most cases. But don't use too low values like 1 or 2, because then all the highlights in your scene will be eliminated and this doesn't look good. So for our scene we maybe not have too much of these fireflies because we don't use much glossy surfaces, so I set up a basic value of 5 for each. Okay, if you render an animation I would recommend to click on this clock symbol here, and this causes that the noise in our scene will change per frame. Here you can see a very simple example. In this first case we don't have enabled the clock, so you can see the noise is static, and personally I think that doesn't look really good. And here in the second example I have enabled the clock and you can see the noise moves in every frame. So basically this feels like a video grain. And if you take a look at real footage of a real camera, you will see that also these records will have this grain. So basically in this case we use this noise to give our scene a little bit more realism. So now back to the question why I have only used 50 samples for our final scene. So we did one render test using 100 samples with full HD resolution, and this took about 40 minutes. The quality was quite okay. And then we tried to render this image with only 50 samples, but double the resolution. So that means in the render settings under resolution, I increase the percentage to 200. That means the resolution will be doubled. And the render with these settings took about 50 minutes, but we have a multiple of the full HD resolution. And then if you scale this high resolution image down to the original full HD resolution, you get a better result instead of rendering this thing with 100 samples. And so the render time just increases a bit, but we have a much better quality. The image also looks just a little bit more clear and sharp. So in our case, this indeed made a difference. Okay, now let's have a look at the light path settings. Summarized, here you can set up how often the light rays which will be sent from the camera will bounce on the different objects of our scene. And certainly the more bounces we use, the better is the quality of our image, but also the longer cycles have to calculate. Yeah, but in reality, in most cases, if you turn down the bounces to a very low level, the quality of the image doesn't change really much, it just gets a little bit darker. And also great about that is that the render time decreases. Okay, first we start with reflective and refractive caustics. Caustics are the bright spots on the other side of, for example, a glass when the sun rays moving through it, and on the other side on the table, for example, the light gets bundled. Also you can see it very good underwater in a pool, for example. Yeah, and Cycles basically can calculate these caustics, but that's not the strength of this render engine. So that means we need very high samples and also some special light settings so that this caustics will look good. But in most cases this causes our fireflies. We can see here in our example scene again. Yeah, and this try to calculate the caustics is the main reason for our fireflies in our scene. Yeah, and because of that I disable both of these options and you can see the fireflies are gone completely. Yeah, so this is the best option to remove the fireflies. Yeah, and because of that I also disable this for our scene here. Then under the option transparency we can set up how deep the light rays can move through transparent objects. And this option is important if you use leaves with an alpha channel on all your trees, for example. Because if you decrease this value, you can see we have this black arrows on our leaves. And basically these are the spots where too many leaves are lying above each other and the light rays can't move through all these transparent surfaces. So that means if you have these black arrows, increase the transparency value. Yeah, in our scene we didn't use any alpha channels or transparent shader, so you can decrease this value. Under bounces you have the option to define the maximum and the minimum bounces, as I described before. In most cases, if you don't have any special refractive shader or reflective shader, you can decrease the maximum value to 4 and the minimum value to 0. In this case, we will increase the maximum value to 8, because under the minimum and maximum value we have also the possibility to change the value for different channels. You see diffuse, glossy, transmission and volume. And diffuse, transmission and volume I set to 4, because volume we need for all the volumetric shaders we have for our little dust particles. And our bicycles have some glossy shader, and because of that I increase the glossy value to 8 because I want to have a better result for the glossy shader. So, and if you don't have any refraction, you can set the transmission to 0, and also if you don't have any volumetric materials, you can set volume to 0. Same thing for glossy. So all in all, test your scene, try different setups here, try to keep all the settings as low as possible so that your render time decreases as much as possible. So the last thing we do here, we set filter glossy to 0.5. That means glossy surfaces will be smoothed a bit, so there will be less noise. Then under film we enable transparent. That means the background will be rendered in transparent. That we will need for the compositing effects we will do in the next video. Then I enable the option motion blur. In real life, if you take a photo of a car which is driving by, you can see it's blurred through the motion blur. And also this motion blur we can add to moving objects in our scene. To show this effect, I've set up another example scene here. The ball is moving from one side to the other. So, and if I render this scene without motion blur, you can see the ball is in the middle of the animation, so it's actually moving. But looking at the image, we can't recognize that the ball is moving. Now I enable motion blur and render this again, and you can see this ball has motion blur, and you can also recognize that this ball is moving very fast. So if you think the motion blur effect is too strong or too weak, you can increase or decrease the shutter value. The lower the value, the less motion blur you will have. So for our scene, I enable motion blur and also use the basic value for the shutter of 0.5. We use this motion blur for our scene because we have all these insects or little dust particles, and also the moving persons and moving leaves on the trees. Okay, let's get to performance, and here we can set up something that's one of the important things to save render time, namely the tile size. Before I tell you more about that, I expand the render panel, and also I open up the user preferences with Ctrl Alt and U, and under System down below you find Compute Device, and if you have a graphics card that supports CUDA, you can click here on CUDA and then save user settings, and this allows us to, besides rendering our scene with the CPU, to render our scene with the GPU, that means with a graphics card processor. And this is great because in most cases the GPU is rendering much faster than the CPU. The bad thing about that is that we are limited to the memory of our graphics card. That means after we hit render, all the data will be loaded into the memory of the graphics card. And in some cases the scene is too big for the memory of the graphics card, and then it can't be rendered. That means in the end we had to render our scene with CPU. But no matter what you are choosing to render, down below under performance tiles we have to consider a certain tile size for the X and the Y value. You can see if I hit render, the image will be rendered with these little squares, and the squares are the tiles, and with the tile size you can define how big or small these tiles are. And there you can keep in mind a rule of thumb. If you use CPU, the computer processor, the tiles need to be very small, e.g. 16 by 16 or 32 by 32. And if you render with a graphics card, the GPU, you should use a value at 256 by 256. So in both cases you will see it will render as fast as possible. And if you try out to use a different value, you can see that the rendering takes much longer. Yeah, try to remember these values, but I know people are oblivious. And because of that, we can simply use the add-on so that Blender will set up the perfect tile size for us. For that, I open up the user preferences, add-ons, and here I search for auto tile size and then enable this add-on, click save user settings. So that means Cycles will set up the tile size depending on if you choose CPU or GPU, and also depending on the resolution you choose, because then he will fit the tile sizes so that every square will render one full part. Okay, let's talk about another small thing. In our scene we have used depth of field. That means objects in the foreground and in the background are blurred and everything in the middle of our scene is in focus. Okay, for enabling depth of field, you select the camera, go to Object Data. Here enable Limits under Display, so you can see the focal point of your camera. And under Depth of Field Distance, you can set up where the focus of your camera should be. And you can see in this case, we have moved the focus to the robot. And you remember our camera is moving. So I have also animated the distance value by moving the mouse cursor above this value, pressing I at some point in the timeline, and then at the end of the animation I do this again and also adjusted the distance value. And then you can see it's animated. So now we don't have any depth of field, we just set up the focus point. And to have some depth of field, I just render a small part of our image and have enabled some objects. And then under Object Data of the camera, under Aperture Size, we can set up how strong the depth of field should be. The higher the value, the higher the depth of field. Here just use very low values, because if you increase it too much, the whole scene looks like a miniature scene. So don't go crazy with this depth of field. For our scene we use a value at 0.01. Okay, now we have set up all of our render settings. But now we still have to define the output folder and file format. For that I click on Render, Output, and up here we can set up the output folder. And for that I click on the folder symbol, then I navigate to my project folder, to the Rend folder. And inside the Rend folder I create a new folder and name this Scene Animation. And then I navigate inside the Scene Animation folder, and up here I type in a name for my animation and then click on Accept. Then down below under File Format we can choose a file format for our rendered scene. On the left side you have different image formats, and on the right side you have some movie formats. In the end we want to have an animation, and you certainly think you have to choose a movie format, but I say no. Personally, I would recommend to render it in single frames using the PNG file format, because with PNG you don't lose any quality. And if you choose an image format, every single frame of your animation will be saved separately. And they have the different numbers for the different frames, e.g. frame 1, 2, 3, etc. And a lot of tools can also read an image sequence, and also you can convert this into a real video file. And the advantage of using this method is that you have every frame separately, and if you have one frame with an error, you can simply re-render this one frame. And also if your computer crashes while rendering, nothing is lost, because you simply can go on with your rendering starting from the last rendered frame. And this doesn't work with a video format. Using a video format, just if everything is rendered, the video will be converted. That means if then your computer crashes, everything is lost. And especially for such large and heavy to calculate scenes like ours here, basically there is no other way than rendering this in single frames, because if one frame takes 50 minutes, you maybe have to render your scene over some weeks. And certainly during such a long time period, you sometimes have to shut down your computer. Then if you choose PNG, you can set up the compression, but compression doesn't mean to lose quality. For the PNG, that means the file size gets smaller the more you compress it. In the end, that means if you have a very high compression, it takes a little bit longer to open this image, but after all, you have the same quality as if you have no compression. So in this case, I choose 50%. So now we are done with our render settings, and now you could render your scene, but we don't do it right now, because in the next video I show you how to add some nice looking compositing effects.